I would like to introduce our second speaker of the day, Dr. Chinmay Tumbe. Dr. Chinmay Tumbe will be talking to you about the social and economic fallouts of the pandemic. He is an assistant professor of the Department of Economics in the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. We welcome you. We welcome you, Dr. Tumbe, and over to you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello, I'm just recovering from a sore throat, so pardon that. Thank you for this very kind invitation. I'm a trained economist. I work at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and I'm no expert on the science of pandemics. But what I'm going to talk today is about how pandemics can alter the economy and the society. And I'm going to do that by talking about a little bit about past pandemics, because this is not the first pandemic that has hit India in a big way. Talk about a bit of the social and economic fallouts of those pandemics, and then start talking about what we are seeing today, what the dramatic economic and social fallouts that we are seeing from COVID-19. So I'm going to share a few slides, and then I'll talk more about COVID-19. Yeah, can you see this?
Your screen is visible.
Great. All right. Right. So when we start thinking about how do we frame the overall impact of pandemics, it's often useful to go back into history to see what did previous pandemics do, and so on. The two most obvious things that any pandemic do is, of course, it kills a lot of people. It's a very terrible event episode to happen. And if any event kills a lot of people, it's also going to, unfortunately, also destroy the economy, because those many people are not going to be able to participate in the economy. And it also kind of shows exactly what the fractures are in society, kind of heightens the anxieties of people, some of it which we saw last year. I'll talk a little bit about, I'll just take 5 or 10 minutes on this, about a previous age of pandemics in India, where India was kind of really knocked out, so to speak, between 1817 and 1920. This is in our history textbooks, we typically learn as the rise and fall of British rule in India. But this is also an age of pandemics in which about 70 million people worldwide died, of which about 40 million were in India alone. Right? And so this was a period of abnormally high mortality, where 3 pandemics, cholera, plague, and influenza, killed. India was the epicenter of mortality in all these 3 episodes. And so I'm going to try and delineate what were some of the major economic and social fallouts and then talk about why this pandemic is, of course, different, and why some things are similar across all pandemics. I'll start with, of course, the most obvious one, which is migration. What we saw last year was fairly horrific, so to speak. India is a country with more than 100 million migrant workers. And this migration, circular migration, has been going on for a really long time now. In fact, my first book, India Moving, A History of Migration, points out that there are some districts in India which have been sending out migrants for more than 2-3 centuries. So this is not something like a 1 or 2 decade issue. And people move out in search of better opportunities. But the remarkable thing about in India is that, unlike in, say, China or many other places, it's mostly the men who move, and they often don't settle down in the cities. They often go back home. So this is what we mean by circular migrant worker. You have one leg in the village and one leg in the city. Now, this is a very disturbing image that you're seeing of what happened last year, when, because of the lockdown, a lot of migrant workers, unfortunately, had to walk back. But this was not the only time this happened. This image that you're seeing now on the other side shows you what happened more than 100 years back during another pandemic. This is during the plague pandemic in Bombay in 1897. And you'll see very similar themes of complete, distraught anxieties and so on. You'll see the lady holding this child in her arms, just like this gentleman here is holding this child on his shoulders. The sense of utter sort of tension, grief as well, and the desperation to leave the city. Yeah. In fact, this particular phrase was heard in 1897 as well as last year, which says something like, "Agar marna hai to gaon mein marenge," which means basically that if you have to die any case, might as well die in the village. Now, this is a very strong kind of observation that has been noted across several pandemics in India, and that's why I'm going to start today's discussion by pointing out that one of the worst affected people in any pandemic, especially in Indian history, have been migrant workers. And this is because migrant workers have these two lives, one in the village, one in the cities, especially circular migrant workers. They come to the city in search of economic security, but the village is the ultimate site of social security. Why? Because your family is there, because you have access to ration cards, you have access to the welfare state today, and so on. Right? And of course, the difference that you see between these two images is that in last year's case, the railways was shut down. And in the case of the plague, the railways, you can see the people are trying to board the trains. And in a way, even last year, the government of India started these Shramik trains, these special trains in May, maybe 2 months a bit late, and finally people could then go back home. But that's what I'm pointing out, that the first big impact of pandemic is actually people who are on the move and who are stuck out. They are stuck out either because transport options have stopped. They're stuck out either because they are not allowed to move back home. And they're stuck out because they don't have the capacity to withhold a life in a city or a destination area without an income. And that is what pandemics are very brutal, is because not only does it take lives, but it snuffs out economic activity. And when economic activity goes down, just think of the big lockdown of last year. Obviously, some amount of lockdown was necessary, but what in India, where so many workers live on daily wages, where so many workers are in the informal sector, 90% of India's workforce is in the informal sector, where so many workers don't have access to social security, where so many circular migrant workers don't have an identity in our cities, there are interstate migrant workers, they don't have access to ration, etc., then it is impossible to survive in a city for even a few more days. So this is why this issue of attending to the call of circular migrant workers is very, very important in any pandemic. And the government of India, I would say last year was maybe a month or two late in understanding this. But then by the time of May, the Shramik trains were introduced, and then the government went all out to try and ensure that free food, a lot of subsidized material was given. But I do think that last year's migration crisis should not have happened. India was one of the few countries in the world which unfortunately got a migration crisis. And I think one of the learnings of this pandemic is that in any future pandemic, we should first put circular migrant workers as one of the high risk group and think of what will happen to them. Now, the story of the economic and social fallout is not just on what happens at the time of a lockdown. The pandemic now, for example, in India and COVID-19 has happened for more than 1 year. In the case of plague, it repeatedly came for 25 years. And as a result of it, economic activity keeps shutting down every time the epidemic flares up. And as a result, people are essentially either not getting rich, either being stagnant, or worse, they're falling back. Right? So people are getting poorer and poorer. Now that of course affects nutrition, that affects health and various other things. This is an image of an outbreak of pandemic outbreak in the US. America had a major cholera outbreak in 1832, 1849, and 1866. And this is again to show you an economic impact of the pandemic, because one of the things pandemics do is often people flee cities. I just told you, people started fleeing our cities from thanks to this reverse migration. But this is exactly what happened in the US as well. This is from this is a cartoon from America, and this particular kind of a demon-looking character is saying, telling the owner of the houses, "You'll have to come down with your rents. I intend to occupy these premises myself." Right? And again, a very clear economic fallout of the pandemic is that housing prices get affected, in the sense that the housing market typically takes a beating because people are leaving the cities to go back. So this is another very well documented aspect of pandemics and its relationship with an economic fallout. Pandemics can often have bizarre kind of surveillance rules put in place. When the plague broke out in the late 1890s in India, this is a photo from Karachi, so technically Pakistan, but that time part of British India. Uh, you'll see, and the reason I'm showing this photograph is because last year we saw a lot of disturbing visuals of people being washed down. You know, when migrant workers reached home, people were being washed down or giving these literally bleach, chlorine, all sorts of things to kind of purify people. You know, this idea that you need to disinfect each and everything in its entirety became such an obsession with the British back then. Unfortunately, some of those things were seen also last year, in a sense that it reaches a point of inhumanness. So a particular danger in any pandemic management is that you do over surveillance, you become over kind of hyper energetic in trying and finding out the disease. And often many of these kind of measures are on hindsight later on seen to be pretty much useless, in the sense that at the time this photograph was taken in 1897, people actually thought that plague was a disease which happened because of bad air. Now, plague later on, 10 years later, the people found out that plague was about rats and rat fleas. So the rat fleas would bite human beings, and that's how we used to get plague. But this is not what people thought in 1897. People thought it's about air, and that people, if they were, inhaling this air, then they would get plague. And one of the classic ways of not getting plague would then be disinfecting him. We now know later on that, of course, none of these measures work. The larger point is that pandemics increase the anxiety levels across the board, not just at the family level, but also at the government level. And so there's a lot of increased surveillance, which often leads to very harsh and disproportionate measures, which usually affect the poor. This is a chart. I know you're school students, but I'm sure you can read this chart very easily. The x-axis shows GDP growth rate. You should know that GDP, gross domestic product, is how much the economy is growing in a year. And the y-axis is inflation, that is how much prices move in a year, right? And each dot out here represents a year, right? So basically, this is a chart of the last 120 years of economic data in India. And what you see is that the two worst years in Indian history have actually both been pandemic years. 1918 was the year of the influenza pandemic, sometimes called as the Spanish flu, but we should not call it the Spanish flu. It is the 1918 influenza pandemic. And 2020, which is last year, which is COVID, the economy of India is supposed to be tanking at about 8% per annum. So you'll see that this minus 10% growth has happened in both the pandemics, 1918 and 2020. Now we say that 2020, the lockdown happened, the economy tanked because of a lockdown. That is, if there was no lockdown, the economy simply would not have tanked. But that's actually not a right analogy, because we have 1918 in which there was no lockdown. But if there's no lockdown and the pandemic actually goes out of hand, then you can get an equally bad economic disaster, because simply put, if so many people start dying, like in 1918 when 20 million people died, and everyone starts falling sick, then nobody goes to work, and then the economy will anyway tank, right? So you can get a lockdown by force, but you can also get a lockdown without force if everyone is sick and nobody goes out to work. And that is why you have to be very careful in pandemic management. But this chart is again just to show you that the two worst years in Indian history in terms of economics are both pandemic years. So one is the science of pandemics, but it's also useful to point out the economic reality that pandemics take a huge beating on the economy. This is just to show you again, this is an advisory notice from 1918 pandemic. This is from the US, where stuff like masks and so on were highly advocated. Now, an important social fallout, of course, of the pandemic is how does the population react to the information that the government is putting out. So, for example, are we all wearing masks now when we go out? In many countries, they refuse to wear masks. They cite, personal liberty and so on. In India, the history has been, if you saw in the 19th century, people refused to take the government seriously. Even today, for example, a lot of people don't take vaccination seriously, unfortunately. In the late 19th century, this was very tough. But over time, because of the pandemic, because of the reality of the pandemic, the government did step in, did try and say that, vaccination may be very helpful for you. And over time, the Indian population has kind of accepted vaccination as an important measure to counter pandemics. So both the cholera pandemics and the plague pandemics, had important anti-vaccination drives at those times. I'm just going to point out some of the big, social and economic fallouts of past pandemics, and then I'll talk about today's pandemic. So one is, of course, from the past pandemics, is the good thing is that we got better global health surveillance. From those, if you think of World Health Organization as a body, it started off in 1948, but really its intellectual origins start in 1851, and they were trying to stop cholera coming from India. But you look at the other points that are put out, these are not really related with what you learn in a science class. These are stuff that you learn in an economics class or a sociology class or a EVS class. So first is laws, right? So the fact that today we are dealing with COVID-19 under a law which was created by the British in 1897. The way we are fighting COVID-19 is under something called as Epidemic Diseases Act 1897, shows you how important laws can be changed, created, and reframed during the course of a pandemic. Right? So this is an important fallout which happened during the last pandemic, one of the last pandemics, which still affects us today in a big way. We talk about vaccine development and how India has become such a big player in the vaccine market, but this did not happen magically. It did not happen. The fact that India is such a great producer of vaccines is not an accident. It's precisely because we had suffered so much from pandemics in the past that a person called Valdemar Haffkine came to India and started developing vaccines against cholera and plague in the 1890s and 1910s. And in his honor, the lab that he ran in Bombay was renamed to the Haffkine Institute. And today's heroes like Serum Institute and Adar Poonawalla, who's the head of Serum Institute, were actually horse breeders. They used to breed horses and they used to provide the ingredients to the Haffkine Institute. Right? Now, why I'm pointing out to this is because many things which happen during a pandemic here are not very easily appreciable, or people don't realize the significance of it until many generations down the line. The fact that Haffkine came to India, the fact that Haffkine was curious to deal with the Indian population, the fact that Haffkine built a team around him, a team of scientists who would be dedicated, who would spend their lifetimes trying to understand, vaccines, diseases in India, and eventually lead to an institute like the Serum Institute, is one of the kind of part dependencies that come out with a pandemic. Now, since many of you are based in Bangalore, you should know that, of course, many parts of Bangalore, like Fraser Town, for example, were created completely because of stuff like the plague. Right? So a lot of urban development have also typically been in sync with pandemic. So typically because of the plague, we say India got its first suburbs, first urban development agencies, thanks to India's plague and so on. Then you might have, had Amul Butter sometime recently. In that, Amul is a cooperative, and there are a lot of famous cooperatives in India. These are not companies, but they're cooperatives where everyone has a stake in running that organization. And the cooperative movement in India, the first people in the cooperative movement of India were actually people who were fighting the plague pandemic in the past. Right? So they were some of the leading people from that time. Now, why am I saying this right now is because pandemics also require a lot of solidarity and civil society action to deal with it. Right? It is not just the government's responsibility to deal with the pandemic. Often, as we saw last year, NGOs, civil society, ordinary people on the ground woke up and said, Lord, let us help others. And in this, we realize, we gain, and we develop a lot of organizational and leadership capabilities. Now, that became very useful in India in the early 20th century in developing first the cooperative movement, and then later on also the freedom movement. Many of the famous leaders like Gandhi, Patel, Sardar Patel, for example, his first big job was to handle plague in Ahmedabad. He was part of the Ahmedabad municipality. You might have heard of people like Gokhale, Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai. A lot of the famous leaders of India's freedom movement had their first major brush with politics in dealing with pandemics. So pandemics can also create political leadership going forward. Finally, something which is very different from past and current pandemics is that in the past, the pandemics actually killed a lot of people, right? Especially with relative to the overall population. Now, just to put in perspective, in the pandemics of the past, say 1918 pandemic, in November 1918, about 200,000 Indians were dying every single day. That is a horrific number. Today, we are saying after 1 year, we have about 150,000 deaths, which is also bad, but it is not as bad as the percentage of overall population compared to 100 years back. Now, that's another thing of pandemics. That is, if pandemics kill a lot of people in a very twisted manner, in a very ironic manner, these people who survive actually do have some bargaining power. Right? And so this is, if you've read something called the Black Death, which happened in Europe in the 14th century, 1/3 of European population was wiped out. Now, the people who survived that actually got a lot of bargaining power because suddenly the labor supply had dried up. So if you're going back to your employer, you have a lot of bargaining power. So think of people working in Bangalore. If suddenly all the autowalas, the supply of autowalas goes down by 50%, then the autowalas can start charging a lot of money. Why? Because they're a restricted supply. So something very similar happened in India after 1918 because 20 million Indians died. And so India's labor movement actually started only after that. So you got trade unions, labor finally got some dignity thanks to a pandemic. So this is one of the unusual kind of fallouts, that if a pandemic actually kills a lot of people, it can have some sort of unintended consequences as well. Now, COVID-19 is not like that. COVID-19 has not killed that many people on a per capita basis, but the economic fallout has been tremendous. So how do we see the economic and social fallout of COVID-19? First, as I said, you should start always with migration. And you should understand that a pandemic is very intimately related with migration. In fact, you can't have a pandemic without having some migration, because pandemic means that some people have to move and they'll spread the disease. So to curtail a pandemic, you have to curtail migration. That is kind of obvious. But how do you do it? How do you plan it? That is all important. So international migration is very easy. You can just switch off the airports and nobody can come to your country. And nobody is going to swim from England or the Gulf, or nobody's going to try and fly from England without a plane and so on. But with internal migration, it's not the same. You can always walk back from Bangalore to Bihar. Right? And if at state borders, if somebody's trying to stop you, people can just walk a few kilometers here and there and they can still continue their journeys. So we have to be mindful that migrant workers do want to go back and be with their families during pandemic. And that is why one of the big economic and social fallouts of any pandemic, especially COVID, has been on migrant workers. And the numbers are huge. As I said, more than 100 million circular migrant workers in India. So what should we do going forward on migration? One, the government of India has now announced something called as One Nation, One Ration Card scheme, which means if you're a Bihari migrant worker in Bangalore, in theory, you should be able to access subsidized food even in Bangalore. Now, this is a very ambitious scheme and it is still not launched fully, but hopefully it is done and hopefully all states of India do. We should move to a system where you can access welfare services anywhere in India seamlessly. Historically in India, you could access welfare services only in the place you were born. Okay, we have to move to a system where you can access it anywhere. Because like Ambedkar said, migration is a great thing. You transmit ideas from one place to another and so on. And so what the COVID pandemic has revealed is the dark underbelly of India's workplace. That is, so many migrant workers work without dignity and that we need to restore dignity to migrant workers. The big fallout, like the gentleman before me pointed out, is education, right? And so obviously, while a few people have been lucky to, I work in a very elite institution where all the students have access to computers and so on. It has been reasonably simple for us in our college to deliver education over the last 1 year. But as you all know very closely, there are clear limits to digital technology. And the big fallout of education in this year has been in terms of lost one entire year's loss in terms of education. I should point out in the past, like in 1918 influenza and so on, it was so bad that a huge part of the Indian, the children sort of age cohort moved to working, right? Because in influenza 1918, the people who died were mostly in the age group of 20 to 40. So imagine losing your parents suddenly in large numbers. So there were a huge number of orphans actually during influenza 1918. And so that entire generation grew up with very, very traumatic scars from their childhood. Health, of course, I'm not going to talk about, I'm sure others have talked about, but obviously, I just want to point out, when we start focusing a lot on COVID-19, it automatically means that we reduce our attention on other diseases, right? But India, you should know, uh, see, as you go from becoming a poor country to a rich country, the share of communicable diseases that we die from reduces, right? So like 100 years back, we used to, almost all of us used to die from communicable diseases, like say malaria, plague, or something like that. Today in India, only less than 30% of our deaths are due to communicable disease. It's still high in America and so on, it's less than 10%, right? And one of the biggest killers in that is tuberculosis, for example. Now, when we put so much attention on COVID-19, what often happens is that the other diseases which hurt us get sidetracked. And that is why we need to also have a year out for people who have not got COVID-19, but other diseases, right? And which are actually if you see the mortality numbers, they're actually higher than COVID-19 in usual years, that those also should not get sidetracked, but demand equal attention going forward. Then the big fallout of the COVID-19 has been on working conditions, right? And in this, the big difference has been about men and women, right? And so men have been able to generally continue working as they kind of please, and women have usually been on the back burner. So a lot of research studies which now show that women have taken on even more responsibilities than from the beginning than during the. I should point out though that COVID-19 in terms of mortality, studies show that men seem to be dying much more than women, right? So in terms of risk factor, but that is not the case in the labor market. The studies are showing that women are much more affected in the labor market than men. So there are a lot of inequalities in India, and the pandemic kind of heightens many of these inequalities substantially. I'll kind of close out by pointing out some of the ways of looking at this pandemic. One way to look at the pandemic is in terms of stages. The first, there's denial, then there's confusion, then there's acceptance, and then there's erasure. Very soon we'll forget about this pandemic. But that would be a mistake, right? And I'll stop the presentation here. We should never forget the pandemic. It's very important to document the pandemic because many of these lessons will be important for going forward, in later years. For example, like I said, this migration crisis, if we had seen our past pandemics, we could have had a ready reckoner in terms of what to do when a pandemic comes, and how do we deal with the inequalities related with the migration pandemic and so on. So to conclude, what are the economic and social fallouts of a pandemic? Firstly, if a pandemic actually kills a lot of people, then there can be some very crazy consequences that actually labor, for example, can get actually more bargaining power. Right? This is what happened during the Black Death in Europe, or in 1918 influenza pandemic of India. But this is not a time like that, right? And so we are not going to see massive switches of bargaining power and so on. This is not that kind of a pandemic. But this is a pandemic which basically enforced a lockdown across the world, and lockdowns basically took people poorer. India as a country became poorer in the last 1 year. The per capita income actually went down. So what we're saying is that as people get poorer, they're also going to be eating less food. The nutrition climb down is severe. People are also getting relatively more malnourished. And that is why any sane public policy has to take into account and provide more welfare services to kind of create a kind of a shock absorber, so that people can go about their daily routines in a systematic manner. And finally, the fact that we might have more localized lockdowns going forward, but hopefully no nationalized lockdowns, because clearly the economic impact of that has been fairly disastrous, so to speak. So with that, I'll end, and be happy to take questions, because I don't want to speak too much, and plus I have a bit of a sore throat, so I'll prefer to speak a bit less. Thank you.
Dr. Tumbe, thank you for your presentation. We do have a few questions. So I'm going to be reading out the child's name who's asked the question, and then you can answer them systematically.
Yeah.
This is from Mayuri Raje from GEMS Modern Academy, Dubai. And she's asking, since the aviation sector has suffered major reverses during the pandemic and has appealed to the government for bailouts. From where would the government be able to amass enough money to provide them this? Keeping in mind that all sections from which income could have been earned have suffered losses.
It's a good question. This idea in the times of economic slowdown, how does the government bail out anybody? Now, in the Gulf, we know that the aviation sector is of paramount importance. A lot of if you think of Dubai as being this major hub of aviation and so on. It's a strategic call. We say this is a strategic call that the government has to take. Right. So, for example, in India, there are certain sectors which the government, like the railways, the government is not really going to privatize the railways. The railways is of key importance in India. So I think the question is, if there's no money, how are they going to bail out? Now, the way we look at it as economists is that you should never think, there's a basic fallacies in economics. One is we tend to think of the government like us, like a household, like a consumer. And we are told from childhood, don't go on borrowing because at some point it will, kill you, because then you have to pay debt and then the interest on debt and so on. The fact is that most governments have lived on debt, which means borrowing money for hundreds of years, right? And so the economy kind of works in a kind of different manner than how households do. But yes, there are thresholds. The government should not go on spending forever or should not be borrowing forever. But it can borrow. And the Gulf, the way I've looked at the Gulf economy is, they are still blessed with certain sectors which will yield money. So if bailing out is a concern, I think the Gulf is, you just need to borrow a lot of money from the international markets. And the Gulf, does have some of that leeway. So it's perfectly feasible. I think if the question is, how is it feasible? You can always bail out your pet sectors in economy by just borrowing a lot of money. If the private sector can't borrow money, then the government will borrow money for you. So that is how I see that happening. But you're absolutely right that it can't allow the aviation sector to die because it's of such importance. And the minute the lockdown eases, it's going to come back. The closest example I can think of is 2001. The terrorist attack in the US, where the entire airspace in the US was shut down. It led to a lot of losses in America. But the airline industry out there came back in the next 10 years. So my sense is that, after this, as the pandemic eases out, the airline industries will come back. And so there will be, of course, very hard losses, unfortunately, layoffs, unemployment, obvious fallouts of a pandemic. But there's no doubt that there'll be huge pressures for a bill.
Thank you. We have a question from the students of Group 8 from Sakar Nagar, and they're saying many job sectors in cities are switching to permanent work from home. How is this going to impact the flow of economy in the urban setting for the long run?
Yeah, very simply put, the question to be asked is what percentage of India's work can be done from home and what percentage of India's work can be done from anywhere. Right? For example, I'm a teacher. I can sit here and lecture my students online. So I can work from home. Now there are studies on this, and it shows that the bulk. Take out agriculture, look at urban areas. The bulk of jobs simply cannot be done from home. And just think of it in terms of the migrant work economy. Think of plumbers, think of electricians, think of cooks, think of the entire the drivers. They're a huge part of the economy which cannot simply work from home. Right? And so very simply put, India is at a level, very simply put, the richer you are on the per capita income scale, the more the percentage of jobs which can be done from home. Right? The poorer you are, the higher the percentage of jobs that cannot be done. You have to go out and work. Right? So the more rich you get, it's easier to stay in the virtual mode for as long as you want. But India, we don't have that choice. We have to, most of our jobs require people to be at both sides. And so that is why we need to get that part of the economy going, of course, with full safety, full precautions. So.
Thank you. We have a question from Avani Bhatt, Euroschool North Campus, and she's asking, how can India bounce back from the economic crisis due to COVID-19 pandemic? The economy took a hard hit during lockdown, so how will the government try to jump back into the economic race?
Sorry, I didn't get you on that.
basically, the question is, how is the Indian government try to jump back into the economic race after taking a hit from the pandemic?
Uh, see, okay, I think I have many questions on this thing about recession, economics. So I'm going to club all those questions and give a broader answer to this. One is, see, the economy of India tanked by about 8%, which means it fell by 8%. Now, even to just get back to where we were in the previous case, it almost by arithmetic, right? Just by doing the same amount of things we were doing in 2019, we will get a growth rate which is very high this year, right? But we should not be happy with a level. This year, we will get more than 10% growth. Okay. Now, we should not be happy with that. Why? Because this is what we call as a base effect. If you go down, the more you go down, the more you will also come up, right? So this is a simple base effect. So we should be more concerned about what will happen in the years coming down the line, right? So that is the question which is asked. So to the question on what is a recession, typically 2 quarters of negative economic growth. To the question on will we bounce back? Yes, we have to bounce back because it's a simple arithmetic. And if the further you've gone down, the further you will bounce back. But the question is, for us to become, for a poor country to become a rich country, think of South Korea, think of Japan. They basically grew at 10% per annum for about 30 years. That is the growth. That is the magic of economic growth. If you can grow at 10% for 30 years consecutively, right, you pretty much go from being a poor country to a rich country. Now in India, we have been growing at about 3% at some point. Then we became 5%, 6%. Max, we went towards about 8%. Now before COVID-19, unfortunately, our growth numbers were anyway falling, right, for many, many quarters. So our challenge is now to not only do this one time. This year, obviously, we'll have great growth. But after that, how do we sustain on a path of decent growth and growth which actually provides employment? Because even in many of the years of so-called high growth, we were not really providing good quality jobs. So our emphasis has to be not only on growth, but on providing good quality employment. So we have to have a two-pronged approach, not just looking at the number of economic growth, but also looking at employment. Because what the pandemic has done is that it's crushed the livelihoods of so many people, right? Very similar to demonetization, for example, that we need to really bring the focus back on livelihoods. And that is why part of it is from economic growth, but part of it also very detailed focus on priority sectors. Now, what the government should do, it has already done a lot of things, right? So if you look at the budget, fair amount of stimulus which is there, but economists are pointing out that because a lot of households, there are two kinds of households in India. One which have actually done well during the pandemic, right? My kind of household, for example, I have hardly spent and I have still got my fixed salary, right? So in the sense, my savings actually during the year have gone up, right? So I am the kind of rich household, but the average household in India is not that. And so that household needs to have a massive injection of liquidity or some sort of a money support. So that is why economists are pointing out that the government needs to do much more in what we call as fiscal stimulus into people's bank accounts. And so that is the debate in India right now. Otherwise, the government has done a lot of good things, made it easier to do business and so on. And so in my view, those are the right things to happen.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Tumbe, you mentioned that the government needs to focus on creating quality employment. We have a question from Anushri, and she's asking, how could we employ the unemployed in order to restart the economy? And this is from Freedom International School.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we need to understand firstly, which are some of the main sectors in which we can get growth as the economy is growing. Typically, if you see what's happened in East Asia, how did East Asia become rich? They exported a lot of stuff. So we have really not kept our eyes on exports all these years. We need to really, as the economy comes back, we're talking about Atmanirbhar and so on. The fact is that we live in an interconnected world. Vaccines is a great example, right? So we are exporting our vaccines now. So we need to get into a lot of lines of export. Why? Because exports means somebody else is going to pay us and make us rich. This is how China has got rich. This is how Japan got rich. This is how South Korea got rich. And now as those countries have become rich, they're vacating the export. They're becoming more driven on internal consumption. So who is now focusing on exports in the world? Countries like Bangladesh. Bangladesh is doing better than India on many counts. Vietnam, but we are lagging behind on that. So we have to focus on, I would say, 3 or 4 priority areas which are very labor intensive, and all of them happen to be export. Right? So one is textiles. Right? So think of the Tirupur hub or Surat hub. We can make them much bigger and employ many more people, employ many more women in particular, which is a big thing in India. We're not employing enough women in industries or services. Leather works. Think of all the labor-intensive export areas which have been hit, especially by the pandemic. The pandemic is going to ease out. It is never going to be as brutal as it was in 2020 in terms of the economic shock. And so we have to kind of plan ahead that, how do we reconnect with the global value chains on certain key labor intensive sectors. Diamond industry, for example, employs. So some of the high labor intensive sectors need to be mapped out, and a huge thrust has to be given out there. Tax SOPs, whatever it is, just like what the Chinese and the Japanese did during their period of growth. There are a lot of sectors in India which are doing very well, which are capital intensive, right? And they probably don't need that many SOPs because they are not employing that many people on a kind of a per profit, say per kind of rupee basis. So we need to focus completely now on labor intensive sectors. And of course, there are some moves in that direction. But when we talk of economic growth as a headline number, especially in a year of a pandemic, we have to be very careful that we don't lose sight that we want economic growth because economic growth usually translates into good jobs. In India, that connection has not necessarily always been true. And so we need to start focusing on both very concretely now, employment as well as economic growth.
Thank you. We have Vrishak Badania from Vidyashilp Academy, Bangalore, asking, sir, do you think the developed country is better or a developing country is better? Because a developed country doesn't have large working population compared to a developing country. I think this question is asked because you talked about being rich puts you in a position that's better off and being poor puts you in a position that's worse off.
Yeah, I think, see, this developing, I mean, these are words used by international agencies and so on. Broadly, we want India to be a country where people can live and aspire and have some basic material, stuff in our lives, right? So when we say India was a very poor country in 1900, it meant that basically India was starving. Right? We didn't really have any food to eat. Today, that is not quite the case in the sense that we are having 40 million tons of food grain stocks just lying out there. Right? So our position on food self-sufficiency has improved tremendously over the last 100 years. But that still doesn't mean we're a rich country because every time we go out on the streets, we can see it, right? It's not quite the case. So when we say going from a poor country to rich country entails many things. It entails urbanization, it entails people moving away from farms to cities and so on. But one of the things which happens is something called as a demographic transition. So a specific question of the age group, it's kind of a given that as you get richer, you're going to get older because fertility rates fall. We start having fewer kids. For example, my grandparents had 8 siblings. I have only one son, and I am the only child. So automatically, as we get richer, we start having fewer kids, and the population growth rate starts coming down. And that's how the age pyramids changes, and that's how countries become older and older. So Japan is, on average, if you go to Japan, the average person is very old. In India, we're saying we're very young. Now, that's not a good thing in the sense that if you take 100 years back, we were even younger, right? But it was not a good thing because we were just dying in such high rates. So we should not see the percentage of workforce in what we're trying to allude to is something called a demographic dividend. It is a dividend in the sense that a lot of the percentage of the overall population being in the working age is very high right now in India. But it's inevitable that we will also at some point become a relatively older country, and that's a good thing because that would also mean better material conditions for the average person and so on. So you should never see it as a bad thing. I think it's a good thing to try and aspire to become a rich country.
Right. We have Tarun. Yeah, we have Tarun asking, can a mixed economy help better in pandemic as they include both the market and the government? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I have to ask, I would love to ask a debate with Tarun on this, but let me just point out, there is really no government in the world which is not a mixed economy. So you, in the sense that you take the American government, which is supposed to be the most capitalist government, they have a government expenditure as a percentage to GDP is something like 20%. That's a massive percentage. We say countries are different. Virtually every country in the world has a massive government. Okay. The difference between America and us is that our government also got into production. Right? American government rarely got into production. American government is into redistribution, but it's still there. It's an important part of the functioning of its society and so on. So this thing about the mixed economy in today's parlance is virtually every government in the world is a mixed economy. In terms of the pandemic, since this is what we're talking about, the response to the pandemic, the fiscal stimulus, that is how much the government has gone out to spend, has been much, much more in the richer world than in the poorer. Partly, of course, because we've been more affected in terms of per capita mortality, but also because they had the bandwidth. Right? So, in fact, it's a bit ironic because all these years they would lecture us saying, be fiscally prudent, don't spend too much money. The minute the pandemic came, the US, injected something like 10% of GDP fiscal stimulus. India's fiscal stimulus is about 2% of GDP. So the average fiscal stimulus in the richer world is about 8 to 10%. In India, it's been much, much less. So they've gone all out, right? And these are supposed to be more capitalist, on this side of the mixed economy, more private sector, less government. But the government out there has gone all out. Think of the 2008 financial crisis. The US government bailed out a lot of banks and so on. So in any society, the government it's kind of widely accepted. The government has to step in when the going goes rough. And when the economy takes a tanking like it's done in 2020, the government does have to step in. And so debts will go up. And to the question on, how much debt can you take? There are some thresholds on this, but the governments around the world have broken all thresholds now. So the US government is, it's gone way above 100% of GDP and so on. And India, in that sense, is doing quite well. So we have much more of a cushion to drive up our debt numbers. We should not think of debt to GDP as a household thing. That is, if this is so much debt, we will collapse. As long as you get your economic growth rate numbers high, you can always pay off the interest and the debt in reasonable amount of time. That's where the focus in this whole debt arithmetic of the pandemic in particular is how do we get growth back on track.
Right. We have one last question, and this is from Carol from St. Mary English High School, and she's asking, will this vaccine help bring the economy up? And she wants to know how much time it's going to take for the economy to get back to its normal rate of growth.
Well, the first question is, obviously some people are benefiting from the vaccine, and that's the people who are making the vaccine. So the vaccine producers themselves are, employing a lot of people. They got massive orders. So obviously as a company, the few companies which are making the vaccines, they're making decent amount of profits. And so that's good news for the vaccine companies as well as the people who are working there. The idea of the vaccine being good for the economy is that as the percentage of population which is vaccinated starts going up, we're going to go out much more confidently in our workplaces. Right? And that's why many places I think should make it mandatory that you see Reliance, you see a lot of these companies, they're now going to take on the bill. Why are these companies now going to pay for the vaccination of all their employees and their family members? Because they know it's smart economics. That is, if you vaccinate early, then these guys can come back to the workforce quicker. Right? And so that is why getting vaccinated quickly is the best way to get the economy back on track. Right? Now, there are, of course, a lot of concerns about the vaccine in terms of how long can the vaccine really last and so on. But the point is, in a pandemic, there are a lot of uncertainties. And the one thing we do know is the vaccine has certain efficacy for a certain time period. Then let's go with it, right? Because let's look at the converse. Suppose we don't have the vaccine, or suppose you don't believe in the vaccine. The economic fallout is going to be that much long. So we should do everything in our capacity to reduce the economic impact. And vaccination is a key part of that strategy.
Right. Dr. Tumbe, thank you so much for helping us understand the social and economic fallouts of the pandemic. I really enjoyed the session, and we got to know a lot of information. Thank you so much for answering all the questions as well. And as I was reading the questions, there's one certain compliment that you got that I forgot to mention. But before we leave you, I'd like to say that someone in fact mentioned that you looked like Dulquer Salman, and I'm quite sure they meant it as a compliment to you. Have a good day. Thank you once again.
Thank you.